The morning sun painted the small frontier church in golden light as people gathered for what should have been the happiest day in young Catherine's life. She stood in the tiny back room of the wooden church, her hands shaking as she smoothed down her mother's wedding dress. The white lace had yellowed slightly over the years, but her mother had spent weeks cleaning and mending it, adding small touches to make it special for this day. Catherine's father paced nervously outside the door. He was a simple man who worked hard on their small piece of land, trying to grow enough crops to feed his family. Times had been tough, and when wealthy rancher William Crawford had asked for Catherine's hand in marriage, her father saw it as a blessing from above. William owned the largest ranch in the territory, with hundreds of cattle and more land than most people could even imagine. The church was filling up with people, mostly William's friends and business partners from town. Catherine recognized very few faces in the crowd. These were not her people. They wore fine clothes and spoke with educated voices, very different from the simple farming families she had grown up with. She could hear them talking and laughing. Outside, their voices carrying through the thin walls, her younger sister Lucy rushed into the room, her face flushed with excitement. "Catherine, you look so beautiful. Everyone is talking about how lucky William is to marry you." But there was something in Lucy's eyes that didn't match her cheerful words. Catherine had known her sister all her life, and she could tell when Lucy was trying to hide something. "What's wrong?" Catherine asked, gripping her sister's hands. Lucy looked away. "Nothing's wrong. Everything is perfect. Father says we should start the ceremony soon." But Catherine could feel her heart pounding. Something didn't feel right. She had barely seen William in the past month, even though they were supposed to be married today. When she had asked her father about it, he had simply said that William was a busy man with important business to handle. The truth was, Catherine barely knew her future husband. Their courtship had been brief and formal. William would visit their small farmhouse, sit in the parlor with her father, and discuss business matters. He would speak politely to Catherine, asking about her needlework or her cooking, but she always felt like he was looking right through her, as if she wasn't really there. Outside, the church bell began to ring, signaling that the ceremony should begin. Catherine's father appeared in the doorway, dressed in his best Sunday suit. His face was pale, and he kept checking his pocket watch. "It's time, daughter," he said quietly. Catherine took a deep breath and walked toward the church doors. The wooden floor creaked under her feet as she made her way down the aisle. All eyes turned to look at her, but instead of the warm smiles she had hoped for, she saw curious stares and whispered conversations behind gloved hands. At the front of the church, the preacher stood ready with his Bible open, but the space where William should have been waiting was empty. Catherine stopped walking, her heart sinking to her stomach. She looked around, hoping to see him coming through a side door, or perhaps running late from some urgent business. The preacher cleared his throat and spoke quietly to Catherine's father. "Perhaps we should wait a few more minutes. I'm sure Mr. Crawford will arrive shortly." But minutes passed like hours. The congregation began to shift restlessly in their seats. Catherine stood at the altar, still holding her small bouquet of wildflowers, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes upon her. The whispers grew louder. Where could he be? This is most unusual. Perhaps something urgent came up at the ranch. But as more time passed, the whispers changed. Catherine could hear fragments of conversations that made her cheeks burn with shame. Maybe he changed his mind. "I heard he was seen talking to that banker's daughter from Phoenix last week. Poor girl, standing there like that." Catherine's father approached the preacher, and they spoke in hushed tones. She watched her father's face grow pale and his shoulders slump. When he returned to her side, his eyes were filled with sadness and anger. "We should go home, Catherine," he whispered, but she couldn't move. This couldn't be happening. William had promised to marry her. Her father had already borrowed money against their farm to pay for the wedding celebration. Her mother had spent their savings on fabric for new dresses for the whole family. Everything they had was invested in this marriage, in this future that was supposed to save them from poverty. One of William's business friends, a heavy man in an expensive stood up from his pew and walked toward the door. As he passed, Catherine heard him say to his companion, "I told Crawford he was making a mistake rushing into this marriage." Smart man came to his senses. The words hit Catherine like a physical blow. She realized that these people, these strangers, in fancy clothes, had known something she didn't. They had expected this to happen. To them, she was nothing more than entertainment. A poor farm girl who had foolishly believed she could marry above her station. The laughter started quietly at first, just a few chuckles from the back pews, but it spread through the church like wildfire. Soon, half the congregation was laughing and making jokes about the abandoned bride who had been left at the altar. Catherine felt her face burning with humiliation. Her carefully arranged hair was coming loose and her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her bouquet. The small wildflowers scattered across the wooden floor, and someone in the crowd laughed even harder at the sight. Her father tried to take her arm and lead her out of the church, but she pulled away. She couldn't face walking back down that aisle past all those laughing faces and cruel whispers. Instead, she gathered up her long skirts and ran toward the side door of the church. She burst through the door and into the bright Arizona sunlight, her white dress billowing behind her. Behind her, she could still hear the laughter and comments from the wedding guests. Did you see her face? What did she expect, really? Her father must be devastated about the money he spent. Catherine ran past the church cemetery, past the small houses on the edge of town, and toward the open desert beyond. Her wedding shoes, thin-soled and meant for dancing, were not made for running on rough ground. She stumbled and fell several times, tearing the delicate lace of her mother's dress. But she kept running. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay there, couldn't face the pitying looks and cruel whispers that would follow her for the rest of her life in that small town. Everyone would know her as the girl who had been left at the altar, the farm girl who had reached too high and fallen hard. The desert stretched endlessly before her, dotted with cacti and scrub brush. The sun was getting higher, and the day was growing hot, but Catherine kept walking. Her fancy wedding dress, so carefully prepared, was becoming dusty and torn. Her hair, which her sister had spent hours arranging, was now tangled and wild as she walked deeper into the wilderness. Catherine didn't realize that eyes were watching her from the rocky cliffs above. Apache scouts who regularly observed the movements around the white settlements had witnessed the entire scene at the church. They had seen the young woman in white running into their territory, alone and clearly in distress. The Arizona desert was nothing like Catherine had imagined from the safety of her family's farm. What had seemed like gentle rolling hills from a distance now revealed themselves as treacherous terrain filled with hidden dangers, sharp rocks cut through her thin wedding shoes, and thorny bushes caught at her white dress with every step she took. By the time the sun reached its highest point in the sky, Catherine was already feeling the effects of the desert heat. Her throat felt dry and scratchy, and sweat was making her carefully styled hair stick to her forehead. The white lace of her mother's wedding dress, which had seemed so beautiful that morning, now felt heavy and suffocating in the blazing sun. She had been walking for hours without any real destination in mind. All she knew was that she couldn't go back to face the shame and embarrassment waiting for her in town. Every time she thought about those laughing faces in the church, her cheeks burned with humiliation all over again. How could she ever show her face there again? How could her family recover from the debt they had taken on for a wedding that never happened? As the day wore on, Catherine began to realize how unprepared she was for this journey. She had no water, no food, and no idea which direction would lead her to safety. The desert all looked the same in every direction. Endless stretches of sand, rocks, and strange plants she had never seen before. Some of the cacti were taller than trees, with arms reaching up toward the sky like they were asking for help. By evening, Catherine's legs were shaking with exhaustion. She had stumbled and fallen countless times, and her beautiful white dress was now torn and stained with dirt and blood from her scratched hands and knees. Her lips were cracked and dry, and she hadn't seen any sign of water anywhere. As darkness fell, the desert became a completely different world. During the day, it had been almost too bright to look at, with the sun reflecting off every rock and grain of sand. Now, under the star-filled sky, it was darker than anything Catherine had ever experienced. Strange sounds echoed across the landscape, howls and calls from animals. She couldn't identify. Catherine found a large rock to lean against and tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. Every sound made her jump, and her mind filled with stories. She had heard about wild animals and dangerous creatures that roamed the desert at night. Coyotes howled in the distance, and she could hear the scurrying of small animals moving through the brush nearby. When morning came, Catherine was surprised to find herself still alive. The sun rose quickly, painting the desert in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. But Catherine was in no condition to appreciate the scenery. Her mouth felt like it was filled with cotton, and her head was pounding from dehydration. She forced herself to stand and continue walking, though every step was now painful. Her feet were covered in blisters, and the cuts on her legs from the thorny plants had become infected and swollen. The white fabric of her dress, once pristine and carefully pressed, now hung in tatters around her. As the second day in the desert progressed, Catherine began to have trouble thinking clearly. The sun seemed to be getting hotter and brighter, making her feel dizzy and confused. She started seeing things that weren't there, pools of cool water that disappeared when she got closer, and familiar faces calling her name from behind rocks. Ambushed. By afternoon, Catherine could barely put one foot in front of the other. She was mumbling to herself, sometimes talking to her sister Lucy as if she were right there beside her, sometimes apologizing to her parents for the trouble she had caused. Her skin was burned red from the sun, and her lips were so dry they had started to crack and bleed. She stumbled toward what looked like a dry riverbed, hoping desperately to find even a few drops of water. The rocky channel wound between two hills, and Catherine thought she could see green plants growing further ahead. With her last bit of strength, she staggered toward the vegetation, praying it meant water was nearby, but her legs finally gave out just as she reached the edge of the dry creek bed. Catherine collapsed onto the sandy ground, her torn white dress spread around her like broken wings. She tried to call out for help, but her voice was just a whisper. The world around her began to spin and fade, and she closed her eyes, certain that she was going to die alone in this vast, empty place. She didn't know how long she lay there before she became aware of footsteps approaching. At first, she thought she was dreaming or hallucinating again. But the sounds were real, soft footsteps moving carefully across the rocky ground. Getting closer and closer to where she lay, Catherine tried to open her eyes, but the bright sunlight made everything blurry and white. She could make out a dark figure standing over her, blocking out the sun. Her heart began to race with fear. All the stories she had heard about Apache warriors flashed through her mind. Tales of raids and kidnappings that had terrified frontier families for years. The figure knelt down beside her, and Catherine could see that it was indeed a young Apache man. He had long black hair and was dressed in traditional clothing made of leather and decorated with beads. His face was serious but not unkind, and his dark eyes showed concern rather than anger or violence. Catherine tried to move away, but she was too weak. She expected him to hurt her or worse, based on all the frightening stories she had heard. Instead, the young warrior gently lifted her head and brought a leather water container to her lips. The water was cool and sweet, the most wonderful thing Catherine had ever tasted. She drank greedily, and the Apache man spoke to her in a mixture of his own language and broken English. "Slow," he said. "Too much water makes sick." His voice was gentle, not at all like the savage war cries she had imagined. Catherine looked into his eyes and saw something she hadn't expected, kindness and compassion. This man, who by all accounts should have been her enemy, was saving her life. As Catherine's strength slowly returned with the water, she managed to whisper, "Thank you." The young warrior nodded and helped her sit up in the shade of a large rock. He examined her cuts and burns with the careful attention of someone who understood the dangers of the desert, through gestures and simple words. He seemed to be telling her that he had been watching her for some time, following her journey through the desert. Catherine realized that he could have approached her at any time during her 2 days of wandering, But he had waited until she was truly in danger before revealing himself. As the sun began to set on her second day in the desert, Catherine found herself in the most unlikely situation she could have imagined, being cared for by an Apache warrior who had every reason to consider her an enemy, but who instead had chosen to show her mercy and kindness when she needed it most. Over the next few days, Catherine's world changed in ways she never could have imagined. The Apache warrior, who told her his name was Joseph in broken English, led her to a hidden spring nestled between towering red rocks. The water bubbled up from deep underground, creating a small oasis where green plants grew thick and birds came to drink in the early morning hours. Joseph built a simple shelter using branches and his own blanket, creating shade where Catherine could rest and recover. He showed her which desert plants were safe to eat and which ones would make her sick. The prickly pear cactus, he explained through gestures and simple words, had fruit that was sweet and full of water. The roots of certain bushes could be ground into flour for flatbread. At first, Catherine was terrified. Everything she had ever heard about Apache warriors told her that she should be afraid. The people in her town spoke of them as if they were monsters who attacked without reason and showed no mercy to their enemies. But Joseph was nothing like those stories. He was patient and gentle, teaching her how to survive in this harsh land. That was his home. Catherine learned that Joseph was not just wandering the desert by chance. He had been scouting the area around her town, watching for signs of trouble. His people had camps hidden in the mountains, and they needed to know when soldiers or settlers might be planning to move into their territory. He had seen the wedding ceremony from a distance and watched her run into the desert. Through their daily conversations, mixing his limited English with her attempts to learn Apache words, Catherine began to understand Joseph's world. He told her about his grandmother, an old woman who was respected as a healer and wise teacher. She had taught him that all living things deserved respect and kindness, whether they were plants, animals, or people from other tribes. Joseph's grandmother had also taught him about the white settlers. She remembered a time when there had been peace between some Apache groups and the newcomers. She had even helped white families who were lost or sick, believing that showing mercy was always the right choice. But those peaceful times had ended when more and more settlers arrived, bringing soldiers who saw all Apache people as enemies. As Catherine grew stronger, Joseph taught her practical skills that amazed her. He showed her how to find water by watching where birds flew in the evening and how to read the sky for signs of coming weather. He taught her to move quietly through the desert, stepping carefully to avoid making noise that might alert dangerous animals or unfriendly people. One morning, while they were gathering plants for breakfast, Joseph suddenly became very serious. He had been listening to sounds that Catherine couldn't hear, and his whole body was tense with worry. He motioned for her to stay quiet and followed him to higher ground, where they could see across the valley. From their hiding place behind the rocks, Catherine could see a group of Apache warriors moving through the desert below. Even from a distance, she could tell they were different from Joseph. They moved with purpose and anger, carrying weapons and painted for war. Joseph's face was grim as he watched them pass. That evening, Joseph explained what Catherine had seen. These warriors were part of a war party that had been formed after a terrible incident 2 weeks earlier. Soldiers from the fort near Catherine's town had attacked an Apache camp, killing women and children along with the warriors. The survivors were now seeking revenge, planning to attack the white settlement to make the soldiers pay for what they had done. Catherine felt her heart sink as she realized what this meant. Her family was still in that town, along with all the people she had grown up with. Even though they had witnessed her humiliation at the church, they didn't deserve to die in a war that had nothing to do with them. Her younger sister Lucy, her parents, the shopkeepers and farmers, they were all innocent people caught in the middle of a conflict they didn't understand. Joseph could see the worry in Catherine's eyes, even though she hadn't spoken. He had come to care about this strange white woman who had stumbled into his world. Over the past week, he had watched her learn and adapt, showing respect for his teachings and gratitude for his help. She was not like the greedy settlers or harsh soldiers he had encountered before. That night, as they sat by their small fire, Catherine made a decision that surprised even herself. Speaking slowly in the mixture of English and Apache words they had developed together, she told Joseph that she wanted to help prevent the attack on her town. She knew it was dangerous and probably impossible, but she couldn't just hide in the desert while innocent people died. Joseph was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire and thinking. Finally, he looked at Catherine and spoke seriously. If she truly wanted to help, there was only one way it might be possible. She would have to come with him to speak directly to the war chief, a respected leader who had the power to call off the attack, but Joseph warned her that this was incredibly dangerous. The war party was filled with anger and grief over the death of their families. They had no reason to trust any white person, and many of them would want to kill Catherine simply because of the color of her skin, even if Joseph spoke for her. There was no guarantee that the war chief would listen, or that the other warriors wouldn't harm her before she could speak. Catherine understood the risks, but she also understood something else. During her time with Joseph, she had learned that Apache people were not the savage monsters she had been taught to fear. They were human beings with families, traditions, and reasons for their actions. The attack on her town was not random violence. It was a response to violence that had been done to them. She realized that most people in her town knew nothing about the Apache way of life or why these conflicts kept happening. They only heard stories about raids and attacks, never about the Apache families who had been killed or driven from their homes. If she could somehow bridge that gap of understanding, maybe she could save lives on both sides. The next morning, Joseph led Catherine toward the Apache camp. As they walked, he taught her important customs and phrases that might keep her alive. He explained how to show respect to the war chief and how to speak in a way that would not be seen as threatening or disrespectful. Catherine's torn wedding dress had long since been replaced with practical clothes that Joseph had found for her, a simple dress, made of sturdy fabric that wouldn't catch on thorns or tear easily. But she had kept one piece of her wedding outfit, a small lace handkerchief that had belonged to her grandmother. She carried it now as a reminder of who she was and where she had come from. As they approached the hidden Apache camp, Catherine could smell smoke from cooking fires and hear the sounds of people going about their daily lives. Children were playing, women were working on crafts, and men were caring for horses. It looked so much like any other community that Catherine had to remind herself how dangerous this moment was for her. Joseph stopped and spoke to her one final time before they entered the camp. He told her that what she was about to do took more courage than most people possessed. Whether she succeeded or failed, he was proud to call her his friend. The Apache camp was hidden in a canyon that Catherine never would have found on her own. As she and Joseph approached, warriors appeared from behind rocks and bush like ghosts materializing from the desert itself. Their faces were painted with red and black designs, and their eyes held the kind of hardness that comes from witnessing too much death and suffering. Joseph spoke quickly in Apache, explaining who Catherine was and why he had brought her. The warriors listened but kept their weapons ready. Catherine could feel their anger like heat radiating from a fire. These were men who had lost family members in the recent attack by the soldiers. To them, she represented everything they had come to hate about the white settlers who had invaded their land. The war chief, a man called Running Bear, sat in the center of the camp surrounded by his most trusted warriors. His face was weathered from years of desert sun and marked with scars from many battles. When he looked at Catherine, his dark eyes showed no mercy or kindness. This was a man who had made the hard decision to lead his people to war, and he would not be easily swayed. Joseph pushed Catherine gently forward and spoke to Running Bear in their language. Catherine caught a few words she had learned: white woman, help, and peace, but most of the conversation was beyond her understanding. She could tell from the voices and gestures that some of the warriors wanted to kill her immediately, while others were curious about why Joseph had brought her here. Finally, Running Bear raised his hand for silence and looked directly at Catherine. Through Joseph's translation, He told her that she had 3 minutes to explain why her life should be spared, and why they should listen to anything a white woman had to say. If her words were not worth hearing, the warriors would end her life. Before the sun moved another inch across the sky, Catherine's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears, but she forced herself to stand straight and speak clearly. She began by acknowledging the pain and loss that Running Bear's people had suffered. She spoke about the children and women who had been killed in the recent attack, showing that she understood this war party was not about random violence, but about seeking justice for innocent lives that had been taken, the warriors murmured among themselves, surprised that a white woman would speak about their losses with such understanding and respect. Catherine continued, explaining that her own town was full of families just like theirs, mothers and fathers trying to protect their children, young people dreaming of their futures, elderly grandparents sharing their wisdom with the next generation. She told them about her sister Lucy, barely 16 years old, who spent her days helping their mother with the cooking and cleaning, and who had never harmed anyone in her life. She described the shopkeeper who always gave extra candy to children when their parents weren't looking, and the old farmer who shared his vegetables with families who didn't have enough food. Running Bear listened without interruption, but Catherine could see that her words were not enough. The pain in his eyes was too deep, and the need for revenge too strong. She realized that talking about innocent people in her town meant nothing to men who had watched their own innocent family members died. Then Catherine did something that shocked everyone in the camp. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small lace handkerchief that had belonged to her grandmother, the only piece of her wedding day that she had kept. She held it up for everyone to see, and then she placed it on the ground and stepped back. Speaking through Joseph's translation, Catherine made an offer that no one expected. She told Running Bear that if he would delay the attack for just one day, she would return to her town and warn the people to leave. She would give them time to evacuate, to take their families to safety. In return, she would come back to the Apache camp and stay as their prisoner, accepting whatever punishment they felt was right for the crimes of her people. The warriors began talking excitedly among themselves. This was not what they had expected to hear from a white woman. Most settlers begged for their lives or made threats about soldiers coming to rescue them. But Catherine was offering to sacrifice herself to save others, including people who had laughed at her humiliation in the church. Running Bear stood up and walked over to where Catherine's handkerchief lay on the ground. He picked it up and examined the delicate lace work, turning it over in his weathered hands. For a moment, his harsh expression softened, and Catherine wondered if he was thinking about the women in his own family who had made beautiful things with their hands before they were killed. The war chief spoke for several minutes in Apache, his voice carrying across the entire camp. Joseph's face grew tense as he listened, and Catherine could tell that the discussion was not going in her favor. When Running Bear finished speaking, Joseph turned to Catherine with worry in his eyes. The war chief had decided that Catherine's offer showed courage, but it was not enough to stop the attack. Too much Apache blood had been spilled for them to turn back now. However, he would allow her to return to her town with a warning. She could tell her people that the attack would come at sunrise in 2 days. Those who wanted to live could leave. Those who stayed would face the consequences, but Running Bear added one more condition that made Catherine's blood run cold. Joseph would have to stay at the Apache camp as insurance that Catherine would return. If she tried to bring soldiers back with her, or if she failed to return as promised, Joseph would be killed for helping their enemy. Catherine looked at Joseph, the man who had saved her life and taught her so much about his world. He had risked everything to help her survive in the desert, and now he was willing to risk his life again to give her people a chance to escape. She could see in his eyes that he was not afraid, but she also knew that his life now depended entirely on her keeping her word. The sun was already setting as Catherine prepared to leave the Apache camp. Running Bear handed her back the lace handkerchief, speaking through Joseph one final time. He told her that what she was doing took the kind of courage that warriors respected, even when it came from an enemy. But he also warned her that if she betrayed their trust, not only would Joseph die, But the attack on her town would be even more terrible than originally planned. As Catherine walked away from the camp, heading back toward the town that had witnessed her greatest humiliation, she carried with her the weight of many lives. Behind her, Joseph remained with the warriors, trusting that she would return as promised. Ahead of her lay the difficult task of convincing people who had laughed at her to listen to her warnings and leave their homes. The desert night was cold and dark, but Catherine walked steadily forward, knowing that she had less than 2 days to save everyone she had ever known. Her torn wedding dress had been replaced by practical clothes. Her dreams of marriage and security had been shattered, but she had found something more valuable than either: the courage to stand between two peoples at war and try to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. Catherine reached the outskirts of her town just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the desert horizon. She had walked all night, her feet bleeding inside her worn boots, but she was driven by the knowledge that Joseph's life depended on her success. The familiar sight of the small wooden buildings and dusty main street looked different to her now. After everything she had experienced in the desert, the first person to see her was old Pete, the blacksmith who was opening his shop for the day. He stopped hammering and stared at her in shock. Catherine barely looked like the same woman who had run from the church in her white wedding dress. Her skin was dark from the sun, her hair was tied back in a simple braid, and she wore the practical clothes Joseph had found for her. "Catherine, is that really you?" Pete called out, setting down his hammer. "We all thought you were dead. Your father has been out looking for you every day since the wedding." Word spread quickly through the small town that Catherine had returned. People came out of their houses and shops to stare at her, whispering among themselves about where she had been and how she had survived alone in the desert. Some of the same people who had laughed at her in the church now looked at her with curiosity and amazement. Catherine went straight to her family's small house on the edge of town. Her sister Lucy was hanging laundry on the line behind the house. When she saw Catherine approaching, Lucy dropped the wet clothes and ran toward her, tears streaming down her face. "Catherine! Oh, Catherine, we thought we'd never see you again." Lucy threw her arms around her sister, holding her tight. "Father has barely slept since you disappeared. Mother has been praying for you every day." Their parents came running from the house when they heard Lucy's cries. Catherine's mother collapsed to her knees when she saw her daughter, overwhelmed with relief and joy. Her father, a strong man who rarely showed emotion, had tears in his eyes as he embraced Catherine, but Catherine knew she didn't have time for a long reunion. She had less than 2 days to convince the entire town to leave their homes, and she knew it wouldn't be easy. These people had spent years building their lives here. They had farms, businesses, and memories tied to this place. Asking them to abandon everything based on the word of a woman who had spent weeks with Apache warriors would be almost impossible. Catherine gathered her family in their small kitchen and told them everything. She explained about Joseph saving her life, about learning to survive in the desert, and most importantly about the Apache war party that was planning to attack the town. Her parents listened in stunned silence, struggling to understand how their daughter had become involved in something so dangerous. "You want us to leave our home based on what some Apache warrior told you?" her father asked, his voice filled with disbelief. "Catherine, how do we know this isn't some kind of trap? How do we know they didn't send you here to make us leave so they can take our land?" Catherine had expected this reaction, but it still hurt to see the doubt in her father's eyes. She tried to explain that Joseph had risked his own life to help her, that the Apache people she had met were not the monsters everyone believed them to be. But she could see that her words were not enough to convince even her own family. The real test came when Catherine tried to warn the rest of the town. She went to the church where her wedding had been planned, knowing that people would gather there for the weekly community meeting. As she stood in front of the same crowd that had laughed at her humiliation, Catherine felt her hands shaking with nervousness. The townspeople listened to her story with expressions ranging from disbelief to anger. Some people accused her of lying or of being driven mad by her time in the desert. Others suggested that she had been brainwashed by the Apache and was now working as their spy. A few people even laughed, just as they had on her wedding day, suggesting that this was another example of Catherine's poor judgment. But there were also people who listened seriously to her warnings. Mrs. Henderson, the schoolteacher, stood up and spoke about how Catherine had always been an honest person who wouldn't lie about something so serious. The doctor pointed out that Catherine looked healthy and strong, not like someone who had been tortured or forced to do anything against her. As the debate continued, a commotion outside the church interrupted the meeting. Someone shouted that riders were approaching from the desert. Catherine's heart sank, fearing that the Apache attack had come early and that Joseph would be killed for her failure to return in time. But when the doors of the church opened, it wasn't Apache warriors who entered. Instead, it was a group of cavalry soldiers led by a young lieutenant from the nearby fort. The officer announced that they had received reports of Apache war parties in the area and had come to protect the town. Catherine felt panic rising in her chest. If soldiers started fighting with the Apache camp, Joseph would certainly be killed, and any chance of peaceful resolution would be lost. She tried to explain to the lieutenant that the situation was more complicated than he understood, but he dismissed her concerns. "Ma'am, I appreciate your worry, but dealing with hostile Indians is military business," the lieutenant said coldly. "We have orders to eliminate any Apache war parties in this territory." The confrontation that Catherine had been trying to prevent was about to happen anyway. The soldiers began preparing for battle, checking their weapons and planning their attack on the Apache camp. The townspeople started to panic, some wanting to flee immediately while others insisted on staying to fight alongside the soldiers. In the midst of all this chaos, Catherine made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She walked out of the church and climbed onto the wooden platform where announcements were usually made. Her voice carried clearly across the crowd as she spoke. "I'm going back to the Apache camp," she announced. "Not as your representative or as anyone's spy, but as someone who gave her word. A good man is risking his life because he trusted me to return. I won't let him die because we're all too afraid to try something different." The crowd fell silent, staring at this woman who had once been the object of their laughter and pity. The young lieutenant stepped forward, clearly angry at what he saw as interference with military operations. "Ma'am, I can't allow you to leave. You'll compromise our tactical advantage and put yourself in unnecessary danger." But Catherine was no longer the frightened girl who had fled from the church in her wedding dress. Her weeks in the desert had changed her in ways that went far beyond her sun-darkened skin and practical clothes. She looked the lieutenant straight in the eye and spoke with quiet authority. "Sir, with respect, you can't stop me. This is still a free country, and I'm choosing to try to save lives instead of watching more people die for no good reason." As Catherine walked toward the edge of town, heading back into the desert toward the Apache camp, something unexpected happened. Her sister Lucy ran after her, followed by their parents. Then Mrs. Henderson joined them, along with the doctor and several other townspeople. "If Catherine is brave enough to try to make peace, then we should support her," Mrs. Henderson declared. The small group that had formed around Catherine represented something new: people who were willing to try understanding instead of fighting. Courage instead of fear, the lieutenant and his soldiers followed at a distance, unsure of how to handle this unusual situation. As they all moved toward the hidden Apache camp, Catherine walked in front, carrying with her the hopes of two communities that had been enemies for so long they had forgotten why the fighting had started. When running, Bear saw Catherine returning. With both townspeople and soldiers, he was initially suspicious, but Catherine kept her word exactly as she had promised. She had warned her people, given them the chance to leave safely, and now she had returned to face whatever consequences the Apache leader decided were appropriate. What happened next surprised everyone present. Joseph stepped forward and spoke to Running Bear in their language, his words carrying the weight of someone who had earned the right to be heard. Catherine didn't understand all of what he said, but she caught enough to know that he was telling the war chief about her character, her courage, and her genuine desire for peace. Running Bear looked at the mixed group of townspeople and soldiers, then at Catherine standing calmly in front of him despite knowing her life was still in danger. After a long moment of consideration, he made a decision that would change everything for both communities. Instead of attacking or demanding revenge, Running Bear chose to honor Catherine's courage by calling off the planned raid. He declared that anyone brave enough to risk their life for peace, even when it meant protecting people who had mocked and rejected her, deserved the respect of warriors. The Apache war chief announced that Catherine would be adopted into their tribe as a sister and a bridge between peoples. The ceremony was simple but profound, with Catherine receiving traditional Apache jewelry and clothing as symbols of her new status. More importantly, she had earned something that couldn't be given: the respect of people from both worlds who had witnessed her transformation from a rejected bride into a woman of extraordinary courage.